This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're going to use economics to examine crime and criminal justice. Violence among Mexican drug cartels has exploded in recent years. On the second half of the show, we'll consider the economic organization of these cartels and how it has changed over time and led to greater violence. But first, we're going to focus on our own criminal justice system. The United States accounts for only about 4% of the world's population, but it houses 22% of the world's prison population. Does our system do a good job of sorting out the guilty from the innocent? My first guest will examine whether the incentives of police, prosecutors, and forensic scientists leads the system to make systematic errors determining guilt and innocence rather than random mistakes. My first guest is Dr. Roger Coble. Dr. Koppl is a professor of finance in the Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University and a faculty fellow in the university's Forensic and National Security Sciences Institute. He's the author of 3 books, including most recently, literally hot off the press, Expert Failure. Roger, welcome to Texas in the show.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here.
So you're my expert today. I'm expecting anything but failure from you, but the book that you've written examines how people in positions of authority and with expertise can systematically make failures in judgment and through a process. And I'll start by telling you just a very brief story here in Lubbock and ask you to generalize this. We have a statue that we raised in Lubbock to a man named Tim Koppl, who was convicted of rape and sentenced to 25 years in jail here in Texas. And he eventually died in prison, but later another inmate confessed to the crime and gave DNA evidence, and Tim was exonerated, and they've raised a statue in his memory. Clearly this was a travesty of justice that was carried out of an innocent person going to jail. How rare are mistakes like this? If we were putting statues up like this, would it be an anomaly to only have one of these, or is this more common than we'd like to think?
Yeah, unfortunately, there'd be quite a few statues. The number, of course, is very hard to guess because errors are hidden and not exposed. If we had some sort of magic way to know when an error had happened, well, we'd use that magic way in the criminal justice system.
Right.
So it's very hard to figure out the error rate. But Michael Reisinger has conducted a study with a DNA exonerations for a period when DNA was not in the courtroom, but then was able to be used ex post. So this is a rare window.
Like this case here where the DNA came out many years after the conviction.
That's exactly right. So it's a rare window to look and see, okay, you know, what fraction of cases really are false convictions. And in the group of cases that he looked at, which of course is only a fraction of the offenses one might consider, he found a factually minimum error rate of 3.3%. So you translate that in a world where we have about over a million felony convictions per year. If that number holds good in other cases, in other offenses than those he looked at, you're talking about at least 33,000 per year. 33,000 felony convictions, false felony convictions per year, maybe 50, 60,000, maybe more.
Wow, so that's a lot of mistakes. So the question is, are these, any system is bound to have some mistakes, of course. The question is, are they random or are they more systematic? Are we equally as likely to find somebody guilty who's innocent as we are someone innocent who's guilty? What are the incentives faced by, let's start with police officers maybe in this.
Yeah, indeed, as your question suggests might be the case, it's not random, it's not evenly distributed across zero, as many pluses as minuses. On the contrary, there are incentives in place in the system for criminal justice professionals to get the conviction rather than discriminate correctly between the guilty and the innocent. So, you know, what I want from a criminal justice system, I want it to sort out who's guilty versus who's innocent, not just get people convicted. So the police, for example, they have typically an incentive to clear cases and get convictions. Okay? And it's quite explicit. In the city of New York, it's the CompStat system, and similar systems exist now in most of the country and indeed internationally, where we're counting all the case clearings, convictions, arrests, tickets, etc. And if your numbers are low, they have to get higher, and there's explicit pressure to do this. So even if you're trying to be, you know, good and neutral and right, some people won't. They'll be like, okay, I'll just grab somebody and pin it on him. But that's not the worst of it. Those are sort of the famous bad apples. That's not a good thing. We would like not to have them. But the worst of it is that you may innocently, under the pressure of these incentives, convict somebody who's quite innocent. For example, I think it's him. I think that's the guy. And then it turns out, so you grill him, and you grill him hard until finally, exhausted, after 20 hours of interrogation, he gives you a false confession. So you think you're doing your job, you've really created a false conviction.
But of course, this is just at the police level, then. They have to take it to the prosecutor. Do the incentives of the prosecutor even this out at all?
And on the contrary, the prosecutor has a constitutional duty to be neutral. And yet, in fact, they are rewarded for convictions. So, no DA ever won office, or very rarely has a DA ever won office, on a let's be soft on crime ticket. So the incentive there, again, sometimes quite explicitly, in 2010 in Colorado, a DA was explicitly offering bonuses to prosecutors who got more convictions. So there again is quite explicit, quite strong, and has this insidious effect of encouraging false convictions.
So let's come really into the wheelhouse of some of your work in your book here on experts, though, is that modern criminal justice has forensic scientists to examine DNA evidence and fingerprints and things like this. I mean, that's hard science, isn't it? Doesn't that solve this problem and keep the guilty from the innocent? Or the innocent from the guilty?
If only it were. Unfortunately, that's really not how it works. Now, the one forensic science discipline that is well grounded scientifically is so-called nuclear DNA, so basic DNA typing. But even that one can go awry. The problem is the evidence is ambiguous, whether it be DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence, shoe impressions, or something else.
What do you mean ambiguous?
Well, so what I mean is that it's not a clear and distinct image, for example, that the fingerprint examiner is looking at, because the fingerprint is smudged. Now, those darn criminals, they don't lay nice, clean prints on the crime scene. That's right. So this isn't something you think of when you're just like relaxing in the evening watching CSI, but it's terribly important for what actually happens with fingerprint analysis. And even DNA, turns out, may be similarly ambiguous. The electropherogram, which is ultimately what the DNA analyst looks at, in a nice, clean case, all laboratory, everything, it's very clear where the peaks are. It's very clear what the identity is here. That's not so true in many cases where the sample may be mixed, where it may be corrupted, where it may have been decayed by exposure to the elements. So now I'm a forensic scientist, I'm looking at ambiguous evidence. I have to make a judgment. And my incentives, which are entirely aligned with the police and prosecution in America today, in almost all cases, in the great majority of cases.
Why are they entirely aligned?
Well, I'll tell you two reasons. Those incentives aligned with police and prosecution just push me toward making the false match that leads to the false conviction in a disturbingly large fraction of cases. The public crime labs are typically organized under the police, so they're working for the police, or in some counties in California for the prosecution, which almost amounts to the same thing. And in fact, in 24 of the 50 states, they're working a little bit on commission. The budgets of public crime labs in 24 out of 50 states are supplied in part by court-assessed fees charged upon conviction. So they're working on commission.
They have a profit incentive to systematically side one way. So we're running a little bit low on time, but some people would probably respond, but the defense is there to, they're not there to establish guilt or innocence. They're just there to get innocence for their guy. Doesn't that even out if we have bias both ways?
If only it did. They're under-resourced. There's a whole discussion to be had about public defender services, but what you don't have is consumer choice. So the public defender, who's already under-resourced in the great majority of cases, has no specific incentive to generate the good outcome. He's a bureaucrat, or he's been commissioned to, he's working for a bureau, or he's been commissioned to work on this one case at less than his usual rates. Whatever, what he doesn't have is an incentive to do a good job so he can get more business. So this plus the under-resourcing, it's a tragedy, it's a travesty.
All right, so in our final 30 seconds or so here, if you could make a reform to the system that you think would make it better dial in on finding guilt or innocence, what type of reform would you make?
Well, there's many things. Three leading things would be masking, so they don't have a cheat sheet to know what the so-called right answer is in the case of forensic science, that there be some redundancy, so that evidence doesn't go just to one lab but to many. This whole issue of redundancy is very important. and a real and substantive defense right to expertise, which does not exist in practice today. So those would help to fix the problems in forensic science. Similar reforms would help regarding the problems for police incentives and prosecutor incentives.
All right, well, thank you for sharing your knowledge about this important topic with us today.
Thank you.
Up next, the economics of Mexican drug cartels. Stick around.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeWitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Daniel D'Amico. Dr. D'Amico is a lecturer in economics at Brown University and the associate director of the Political Theory Project at Brown University. Much of his research focuses on crime and incarceration and things we're going to talk about on today's show. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So, it's been in the news a lot lately about increasing violent crime in Mexico. In fact, we were negotiating having a conference somewhere, and the State Department issued a warning about more areas of Mexico that are not safe for U.S. citizens to travel to. What's happening with violent crime in Mexico and other areas of Central America?
Yeah, to be honest, I hadn't really followed this issue terribly closely until a student co-author brought it to my attention, and it really struck out because, like you said, I study crime and punishment at the sort of global level, and most of Europe, the United States, most developed countries, we're at historic lows in terms of violent crime. Uptick this past year in some major American cities, but radical declines compared to the 60s, the 70s, et cetera. And so Mexico especially, and a lot of other Central American countries have seen this doubling and tripling of really heinous forms of violent crime. We're not just talking about like muggings and purse snatchings. We're talking about homicides and kidnappings have tripled, quadrupled since 2006.
So what's going on and contributing to this phenomenon that we're seeing in these countries?
So I think there's been a major shift in what economists would call industrial organization of the drug trade. How many different drug trade organizations, the suppliers, how many of them populate the market and how big they are. Prior to the late 1990s and early 2000s, the cliched vision of large-scale drug cartels, Pablo Escobar and his sort of like huge infrastructure of production and distribution, that was the norm. There were a very few number of major players in the international drug trade, and now what we're seeing is that those large-scale operations have splintered into smaller units.
So wait, this isn't just a growth in the drug trade then that's brought in more organizations?
It's a restructuring, exactly. It's difficult to estimate exactly how much drugs are being produced or distributed. I mean, drug consumption rates in the United States, and like the way we measure that is like high school students reporting whether or not they're consuming certain substances, drug arrests and things like that. They're relatively stable and or declining in
Despite
the American
opium epidemic going up, the
overall consumption is shifting from substance to substance, but like the net totals, you're hard pressed to say that like, oh, this entire phenomenon is necessarily growing.
So that wouldn't be responsible then for an increase in cartel violence.
Exactly. So a lot of what this recent project that I'm working on is looking at specifically is this reorganization of the supply side of this market. How it is that we've shifted from a few major players to now dozens and dozens of small scale operators.
So let's dial this back to Pablo Escobar time then and subsequently in the 80s even. Why was it the case that you saw such kind of large monopolies in this industry?
The argument that we lay out, I think, is that the conditions of the market lend themselves to that. mainly that the international nature of the drug trade in Central and South America is different from domestic drug trade. In the domestic setting, generalized prohibition, the idea that a substance is illegal to buy, to sell, to hold, to consume, whatever, has a general deterrence from any organization growing too large. You're not going to see a marijuana or cocaine dealer on the streets of Chicago start a big advertising campaign. They're not going to buy billboards. They're not going to try to sell T-shirts that support their brand or anything like that. So there's a limit to how big
but go back. I mean, it was the mafia who was in this before, though, and that was it wasn't a monopoly, but a cartel-like arrangement of different groups, right?
Sure, but even still, the organized crime tends to select what types of substances or industries to get involved in based on whether or not they're going to attract untoward attention to themselves, whether or not it's going to attract additional hand of the state, so to speak.
So this is classic Michael Corleone, right?
Yeah.
Booze and gambling, yes, but drugs no, as he says in that episode, right?
More or less, that's exactly what you saw in the international trade, is that there was a lot more potential to get bigger and to continuously take advantage of economies of scale. Producing most of these substances is pretty crude and rudimentary agricultural production functions. And then once you have a reliable channel for distributing it across the political border in the United States, there was a strong incentive to monopolize that and to discourage other entrants. So the heyday of the drug cartels was just that, one in which all of the incentives are arranged to not only continuously grow in your production and operations, but to suppress new entrants violently and coercively.
Right. As you get bigger, you have a greater capacity for violence where, unlike a private company who can't stop a new competitor from coming in, a drug cartel.
So, all the much more, it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy as a cartel got bigger and its reputation more threatening. Smaller operators or new entrants were all the more deterred from trying to compete.
Right. So then, what the heck changed?
Well, the major thing is that the two governmental players in the story, the federal government of the United States and the presidency regime of President Calderon in Mexico, really changed their strategy of how to react to drugs, in large part because the drug trade was really growing in the 70s through the 90s. The sort of public concern about drug consumption, overdoses, those sorts of things, sort of demanded some form of response, but it's not necessarily clear how that response was effective in terms of this violent reaction. So what we saw was what was called the Kingpin Strategy, where they basically said, okay, here are the major operators, here are the major leaders of those operations. We're going to go full force and do detective work and targeting particularly those leaders. And so it really changed the incentives of growing in that industry from a monopoly sort of supportive environment to one where these big scale operations were inclined to break apart into independent units. And now this multiplicity of dozens and dozens of operators, they're really contesting for profits and market share with one another. And I think that's leading to a lot of the violence.
And some of the old kingpins, Pablo Escobar among them, got knocked off in the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is it now then just a situation of they've used this kingpin strategy and chopped off the big ones and broken them up, or they splintered on their own doing in order to avoid the kingpin? How come they haven't? Is it just a market resorting now as they're reaggregating up and they have to fight it out?
You would think that now that the president of Mexico has sort of changed hands, that there'd be a return to the monopoly model, a return to the large cartel.
Because the kingpin strategy is basically ended?
Well, not necessarily basically ended. One question is what kind of credible commitment there is from the government to sort of stop doing those old strategies. I suppose you could just say, well, we never know if that'll happen again, and so now the perpetual incentive is to stay small. But mostly, there's a unique cost of coping in an environment with lots of suppliers. Because this supply in illicit substances requires violence, you've now got a very unique form of doing business with lots and lots of competitors who pose a real violent risk to your operation. So if you're going to be a bigger seller in an environment that starts with 50, 60 suppliers, it's gonna be a much more cutthroat process of growing large in this environment than it was in the 70s when there weren't really many other competitors on the scene.
So as a result of this enforcement strategy, from a public interest standpoint, would you say that it's made the world a worse place now?
It's hard to measure. It really depends on how bad you view the distribution of drugs into the United States relative to the death tolls of innocent civilians in Mexico. I mean, the biggest thing I would say is that there's really bad incentives for federal foreign aid and military interventionism in the United States, because we're basically not feeling the costs of the violent death toll that Mexico is, and feeling a marginal benefit if insofar as you view these substances as like a scourge on local communities here. We get deterrence, or we get fewer drugs in the States at the expense of deaths abroad. So it's really hard for our citizens to react to that in a responsive manner, or our politicians necessarily to take that into account when they're making their strategies.
Yeah, and there's at least one other way that it spills down too, is not just violence, but when I think of a lot of these Central American economies and drugs, I think of corruption and the role that the drug trade plays in corrupting the politics of these places.
Yeah, I mean, the estimations on the monetary influence of Mexican and Central American politics is huge. I mean, that's one strategy that's used to circumvent. If you're making tons of money on the drug trade and you want to get away with buying and selling without necessarily succumbing to law enforcement, you can easily buy off politicians because you're making all of this money.
In fact, that's one of the things that the more monopolized firms have an advantage at then.
So again, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you've got the bulk of your economic process going through the drug trade, it's going to hinder like more legitimate forms of economic development.
So are we in Mexico and other Central America in a catch-22 here? Is there a way out of this? What's the best way out of this?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the answer is obvious per se, but I do think that you're hard pressed to find examples where liberalization of illicit substances hasn't had really beneficial effects. That you would curtail a lot of this monopoly power and profit motive in some of these substances if you had legal and viable alternatives. So one of the big things that we've seen is a retreat from the marijuana production and distribution in exchange for the remaining prohibited substances like opium and cocaine. There isn't as much violence and or profit to be made in buying and selling marijuana, in large part because of the massive amounts of liberalization that have taken place in the States in recent years.
Which is not unlike what we saw at the end of alcohol prohibition and violence between gangs there. And
similarly with Portugal in a variety of substances in recent years, as well as some of the Scandinavian countries with their more liberal attitudes on the sex trade.
All right, well, Dan, thank you for joining us and talking about this today.
Always great to be here, Ben. Thanks.
Well, today we explored crime and criminal justice on the show. We often see some of the negative side effects of America's war on drugs in our own communities in this country, but we often don't see the crime that's associated with it in other countries. Our second guest today helped us to explain why the violence has increased so much in Mexico and how it's related to the global war on drugs. In the first half of the show, we learned about how our criminal justice system might make systematic errors on things that most of us would think are objective science, in particularly things like forensics. And our guest there, I think, makes valuable points in asking about the incentives within the system and how they might be rearranged to better distinguish between guilt and innocence. He ends his most recent book, Expert Failure, with the advice to value expertise, but fear expert authority. I'd like to think, well, certainly we don't have any expert authority on this show, but I hope you do value the expertise of my guests like these and the others on other episodes. We'll see you next week.